The Impossible Night, September 7th, 1191 AD. Picture this, it's 3 hours past midnight on September 7th, 1191 AD. The coastal plains south of Arsuf, along the road between Jaffa and Caesarea, lie bathed in Mediterranean moonlight. 7,000 Muslim warriors, Saracens, Turks, Mamluks, and Bedouin auxiliaries sleep in scattered encampments across the sandy terrain. Their campfires have burned down to glowing embers. Sentries posted at the perimeter have grown drowsy in the cool pre-dawn hours, lulled by the rhythmic crashing of waves against the nearby shoreline. The air smells of salt, horse sweat, and the lingering smoke of evening meals. These 7,000 men believe themselves safe. Why wouldn't they? They're part of Sultan Saladin's vast army that has been shadowing the Crusader forces for weeks, harassing their march down the Palestinian coast. They outnumber King Richard's mobile cavalry forces by more than 20 to 1. They have the advantage of knowing the terrain intimately. They can melt into the landscape whenever Richard's heavily armored knights attempt pursuit. They are the hunters, not the hunted. But on this particular night, 80 Christian knights are about to rewrite the mathematics of medieval warfare in the most brutal fashion imaginable. This is the story of one of history's most savage and tactically brilliant night raids, a massacre so complete, so surgically executed, that it would echo through military academies for centuries. This is the story of how Richard Plantagenet, King of England, turned the fundamental disadvantage of the Third Crusade into a bloodbath that would break the morale of Saladin's forces and secure the Crusader corridor to Jerusalem. The Strategic Nightmare, August-September 1191. Let's rewind 3 weeks to understand why Richard the Lionheart would authorize what amounts to a medieval special operations strike deep into enemy-controlled territory. The year is 1191, and the Third Crusade hangs by a thread. Jerusalem fell to Saladin 4 years earlier in 1187, a catastrophic loss that sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. The Holy Sepulchre, the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, the spiritual heart of Christianity, now sits in Muslim hands. Pope Gregory VIII had declared a crusade, and 3 of Europe's most powerful monarchs answered the call: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip II Augustus of France, and Richard I of England. But Frederick drowned crossing a river in Turkey before ever reaching the Holy Land. Philip Augustus, after helping Richard capture the vital port city of Acre in July 1191, promptly sailed back to France, citing illness but more likely nursing wounded pride and jealousy of Richard's military genius. This left Richard with perhaps 12,000 men, knights, sergeants, crossbowmen, and infantry, to somehow retake Jerusalem from Saladin's armies that could field upwards of 30,000 warriors. Think about that ratio. Think about trying to conduct offensive operations in hostile territory where you're outnumbered 3 to 1, where every village might contain enemy scouts, where the terrain itself seems designed to favor the swift, lightly armored Muslim cavalry over your slow-moving, heavily armored European knights. Richard had just marched his army south from Acre toward Jaffa, a grueling 70-mile trek along the coast. Saladin's strategy was elegant in its simplicity: shadow the Crusader column, launch constant harassing attacks, wear them down with arrow volleys from mounted archers who would gallop away before the Crusader knights could engage in proper combat, deny them water, burn their supplies, force them to march in the brutal Palestinian summer heat wearing 60 pounds of chain mail and plate armor. Break them psychologically before the decisive battle even begins. And it was working. Richard's army was bleeding men daily, not from pitched battles, but from exhaustion, dehydration, and the psychological torture of constant, unpredictable attacks. The Crusaders couldn't sleep properly. They couldn't forage effectively. Every step southward felt like walking deeper into a trap. On September 7th, 1191, Richard had just fought the Battle of Arsuf, one of the few major field battles of the Crusade. He'd won decisively, breaking Saladin's formations and sending them retreating inland. But here's what the history books often gloss over: winning the battle didn't solve Richard's fundamental problem. Saladin's army simply withdrew, regrouped, and would be back to harassing the Crusader march within days. Richard had won the tactical engagement, but remained trapped in the same strategic nightmare. His scouts brought him intelligence that night that would change everything. A large Muslim force, perhaps 7,000 strong, had encamped in a vulnerable position just 15 miles from the Crusader lines. They were spread out across the coastal plain in smaller groups, confident in their numerical superiority and the protective screen of terrain between them and Richard's army. The mathematics of massacre. Richard the Lionheart wasn't called Lionheart for his kindness. The man was 34 years old in 1191, already legendary for his tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness. He'd spent his entire adult life fighting against his own father Henry II, against his brothers, against Philip Augustus, against rebels in Aquitaine. War wasn't something Richard did, it was what he was. When his scouts described the enemy encampment, scattered groups, minimal sentries, overconfident, Richard's mind immediately calculated the geometry of slaughter. Here's what most people don't understand about medieval cavalry warfare. Heavy cavalry, properly deployed, wasn't just militarily superior to infantry, it was psychologically devastating on a level that's hard to appreciate in our modern context. A mounted knight in the 1190s represented the cutting edge of military technology. The stirrup, perfected centuries earlier, transformed the mounted warrior from a mobile archer into a shock weapon. The knight, his horse, his armor, his lance, all combined into a single system designed to break formations through sheer kinetic energy and terror. But heavy cavalry had massive limitations. They were slow to deploy. They required long sightlines and relatively flat terrain for the charge to be effective. They were vulnerable to prepared defenses, stakes, trenches, massed archers, and they were extraordinarily expensive. Each knight represented years of training and wealth, equivalent to a small village's annual output. What Richard was contemplating broke every conventional rule of cavalry deployment. Night operations, suicidal, horses could stumble, formations could scatter in the darkness, friendly fire casualties would be catastrophic, deep penetration raids behind enemy lines, madness, you'd be cut off, surrounded, overwhelmed by numbers. Attacking an encampment of 7,000 with only 80 men, the mathematics alone suggested certain annihilation. But Richard understood something that most medieval commanders didn't: the difference between fighting men who are awake, armed, and organized versus men who are asleep, scattered, and vulnerable. He understood that warfare isn't just about numbers, it's about concentration of force at the decisive point. And in the pre-dawn darkness of September 7th, with surprise on his side, 80 elite knights could become the most lethal force on Earth. The War Council, doubt and decision. Richard's War Council that evening was tense. Picture the scene: inside the royal pavilion, lit by oil lamps and candles, the air thick with heat and the smell of unwashed men and leather armor. Around a wooden table, covered with crude maps drawn on parchment, stand Richard's most trusted commanders. There's the Duke of Burgundy, representing what remains of the French contingent. There's Henry of Champagne, Richard's nephew, young but already proving himself capable. There's the masters of the Templar and Hospitaller military orders, warrior monks who had been fighting in the Holy Land for generations and knew the territory and the enemy better than anyone. Richard lays out his plan. 80 hand-picked knights would ride out at midnight. They would navigate 15 miles through partially hostile territory in complete darkness, using only the stars and moonlight for navigation. They would infiltrate to the enemy encampment, divide into 4 groups of 20, and strike simultaneously at the 4 main clusters of sleeping warriors. The goal wasn't battle, it was extermination. The objections came immediately. The master of the Hospitallers, a grizzled veteran of 20 years fighting Saladin's forces, was the most vocal. "Sire, this is suicide dressed up as strategy. 7,000 men, even sleeping, don't just let themselves be slaughtered. The moment the alarm is raised, you'll have 80 men surrounded by thousands. They'll be pulled from their horses and butchered." The Duke of Burgundy added his concerns about the political implications. "If this fails, if we lose 80 knights, you'll have depleted our cavalry by a significant percentage for no gain. Worse, you'll have handed Saladin a propaganda victory. The great Richard the Lionheart, sending his knights to die in a desperate night raid. It reeks of desperation. Even Henry of Champagne, loyal to his uncle, raised tactical concerns. How will they navigate in darkness? How will they coordinate the simultaneous strike? How will they withdraw without being cut off in daylight? Richard listened to all of it. He stood there, his red-gold hair catching the lamplight, his pale blue eyes moving from face to face. And then he spoke, his voice carrying that absolute certainty that separated legendary commanders from merely competent ones. You're all thinking about this wrong. You're imagining a battle. This isn't a battle. This is a culling. When you slaughter pigs, do the pigs mount a coordinated defense? No, they panic, they scatter, they trample each other trying to escape. 7,000 men woken from sleep by armored killers emerging from the darkness. They won't organize. They won't form ranks. They'll die or they'll run. And we're not trying to occupy ground or hold territory. We strike, we kill, we withdraw before they can comprehend what's happened. It's not warfare, it's terror delivered with surgical precision. He paused, letting that sink in. Then he continued. As for the political implications, if it fails, yes, we lose 80 men. But if we continue as we are, being bled by constant harassment, we lose the campaign. Saladin's strategy is to never give us the decisive battle we need. He'll shadow us, harass us, wear us down until we're forced to withdraw or foolish enough to march into the interior where we can be surrounded and destroyed. This raid sends a message. Nowhere is safe. Not their supply camps, not their resting points, not their staging areas. We turn their own tactics against them. We become the ones who strike from nowhere and disappear. The room fell silent, because here's what Richard understood that his council didn't yet grasp. Warfare is 50% logistics, 30% tactics, and 20% psychology. And sometimes, a single dramatic action could accomplish more than months of conventional campaigning. The raid was authorized. Selection and preparation, the chosen 80. Richard didn't select his 80 raiders from the general cavalry. These would be volunteers from the absolute elite, men who had proven themselves in combat, who could ride in darkness, who had the mental fortitude to ride into nightmare odds and execute their mission with mechanical precision. 20 came from Richard's own household knights, men who had been with him for years, who had fought in France, who would follow him into hell without question. Another 20 came from the Templars, warrior monks who combined religious fanaticism with professional military excellence. 20 more from the Hospitallers, equally skilled. The final 20 were a mix of the best knights from the various English, Norman, and Angevin contingents. Each man was equipped identically, full mail hauberk, mail shows protecting the legs, a surcoat bearing their identifying colors, though these would be covered by dark cloaks for the approach, an enclosed helm, a 12-foot lance, a sword, and a mace or warhammer for close combat. Their horses were the best available, destriers, the medieval equivalent of tanks, animals trained for combat and capable of devastating shock when spurred into a charge. But here's the critical detail that made this mission possible. These men stripped down their equipment for speed and silence. No plate armor, which was still relatively rare in 1191 anyway, no banners or pennants, no trumpets or drums. The horses' hooves were wrapped in cloth to muffle their sound. The weapons were blackened with ash to prevent moonlight reflection. This wasn't a glorious cavalry charge with fluttering banners and trumpet calls. This was assassination on an industrial scale. Richard personally briefed the raiders. He spread out the rough maps his scouts had drawn, the coastline, the road, the wadis and dry riverbeds, the approximate positions of the enemy encampments. He designated 4 strike teams, each under proven commander. The Templar contingent would hit the northernmost camp cluster. The Hospitallers would take the southern group. Richard's household knights would strike the eastern camps closest to the main road. The mixed contingent would hit the western camps near the beach. The timing was crucial. They would leave at midnight, allowing 3 hours to cover 15 miles, a cautious pace that prioritized stealth over speed. They would strike at 3 in the morning. The hour when human alertness is at its lowest, when even sentries struggle to stay awake. They would have at most 30 minutes before organized resistance could form. Then they would withdraw by different routes, using the pre-dawn darkness as cover, rendezvousing at a designated point 5 miles north before returning to the main Crusader lines. Richard gave them one final instruction, and this is where his ruthlessness becomes crystalline. no prisoners, no mercy, every man you encounter is to be killed. We're not there to fight, we're there to exterminate. Strike fast, strike brutally, and give them no chance to surrender or flee in an organized fashion. Make them understand that sleep itself is no longer safe. Make them fear the darkness. At midnight, the 80 riders departed through the northern perimeter of the Crusader camp, disappearing into the Palestinian night like armored ghosts. The approach, 15 miles through enemy territory. Imagine the psychology of those 80 men as they rode through the darkness. The moon, nearly full, provided enough light to navigate, but also made them visible to anyone watching. They rode in a loose column, staying off the main coastal road, using the slightly elevated ground to their left to screen their movement from any observers near the beach. The only sounds were the muffled clopping of wrapped hooves, the creaking of leather saddles, the breathing of men and horses. No one spoke. Hand signals only. They passed within half a mile of at least 2 smaller Muslim encampments, clusters of sleeping men around dead campfires, completely oblivious to the death riding past them in the darkness. The lead scouts, Templars with years of experience in the Holy Land, navigated using a combination of stellar navigation and terrain features. The coastline to their right, always audible through the wave crash, provided their primary orientation. The occasional wadi, the scattered palm groves, the ruins of ancient structures, all these matched the descriptions they'd memorized from the briefings. Around 2:30 in the morning, they reached the overlooking position about a mile from the target encampments. The 4 commanders gathered for a final coordination. Below them, spread across the coastal plain, they could see the dying campfires of approximately 7,000 sleeping men. The camps were indeed scattered, dozens of smaller groups rather than one concentrated force, perfect for what was about to happen. The 4 strike teams separated, each moving into position for their designated targets. The timing was synchronized using nothing more sophisticated than experience and instinct. When you reach your position, count to 200, then charge. It was crude but effective. At 3 o'clock in the morning, as the night reached its darkest hour before dawn, 80 Christian knights lowered their lances and spurred their warhorses into a gallop towards 7,000 sleeping Muslims. The slaughter begins, 3 a.m., September 7th. The Templar contingent struck first, purely by coincidence of positioning. 20 mounted knights, each riding a 1,500-pound destrier, hit the northernmost camp cluster at full gallop. Here's what you need to understand about the physics of this. A mounted knight at full charge represents roughly 2,000 pounds of meat, bone, armor, and steel moving at 20 miles per hour. The kinetic energy is comparable to a modern automobile crash. When that lance tip, designed specifically to concentrate all that energy into a point smaller than a coin, impacts a human body, the result isn't a wound, it's catastrophic structural failure. The first tent cluster, about 300 men sleeping in rough circles around extinguished fires, had perhaps 3 seconds of warning. The thundering of hooves, a sound like the earth itself breaking open, men jerking awake, confused, disoriented. Then the horsemen were among them. The lances went in first. At that speed, the lances didn't stop when they hit bodies. They punched through sleeping men, through the sand beneath them, through the next man behind them. Knights dropped their lances when they became too embedded with corpses and drew their swords and war hammers. The destriers, trained for combat, kicked and bit and trampled. Within 90 seconds, 300 men had been reduced to screaming, panicking chaos. Half were already dead or dying. The others were running blindly into the darkness, unarmed, unarmored, not even sure what was attacking them. The Templars didn't pursue the runners. That wasn't the mission. They systematically rode through the camp area, killing anyone still moving, then galloped toward the next cluster of tents. Simultaneously, the other 3 strike teams hit their designated targets. The Hospitallers crashed into the southern camps. Richard's household knights struck the eastern groups. The mixed contingent hit the beachside encampments, all within 3 minutes of each other, all with the same devastating effect. Now picture the psychological impact. You're a Mamluk warrior, a professional soldier who has survived dozens of battles. You're sleeping soundly, confident in your numbers, confident in your security. Suddenly you're jolted awake by screaming, by the thunder of hooves, by your tent collapsing on you as a warhorse tramples through it. You struggle out from under the canvas and immediately take a sword blow that nearly severs your arm. You see armored demons on enormous horses moving through the camp like apocalyptic reapers. You have no weapon, no armor, no idea how many attackers there are or where they came from. Your only instinct is to run. And that's exactly what thousands of them did. They ran away from the coast, away from the camps, inland toward where they hoped Saladin's main force was positioned. In the darkness, they couldn't see that there were only 80 attackers. They couldn't organize a defense because they didn't know what they were defending against or from which direction the attack had come. The systematic extermination, 3:00 a.m., 3:30 a.m. For 30 minutes, the 80 Christian knights conducted what can only be described as a mechanized massacre. They moved from camp cluster to camp cluster, each team operating independently but following the same brutal protocol. Charge through the camp at full speed, lances lowering to impale anyone in the path. Drop the lances when they become too cumbersome, draw swords and war hammers, ride down any organized resistance, kill anyone who stands to fight, which was remarkably few, move systematically through the tent areas, trampling, striking, crushing. Spend no more than 5 minutes at each location, then move to the next cluster. The household knights, led by one of Richard's most trusted captains, hit a cluster of approximately 800 men near the main coastal road. This group was better organized. Some of the men were already awake, perhaps preparing for dawn prayers. They had a few seconds more warning than the other camps. It didn't matter. 20 armored knights hitting 800 unarmored, unprepared men wasn't a fight, it was a harvest. Swords rose and fell with mechanical efficiency. The warhammers were particularly devastating. A single blow from a steel warhammer swung from horseback could cave in a skull, shatter a ribcage, pulverize a shoulder. And unlike swords, hammers didn't get stuck in bodies. You could strike and strike and strike without slowing down. Some of the Muslims tried to organize resistance. A group of 50 or 60 Mamluks, professional soldier slaves who were among the best warriors in the Muslim world, managed to form a rough defensive cluster. They had grabbed whatever weapons were closest, swords, spears, axes. They positioned themselves in a circle, spears facing outward, preparing to receive the mounted charge. In a conventional battle, this might have worked. Spears are effective against horses. A good spearman can kill a charging destrier before the lance reaches him, but this wasn't a conventional battle. The Crusader knights simply rode past the defensive cluster, ignoring it entirely. They weren't there to fight defensive formations. They were there to kill vulnerable targets. The 50 Mamluks stood there, weapons ready, watching the knights ride past them toward more exposed groups of fleeing men. Then, as the knights circled back after clearing the next tent cluster, they hit the Mamluk formation from behind, collapsing it in seconds. That's the thing about medieval cavalry doctrine that Richard understood perfectly. The charge works best against targets that aren't prepared for it. Any defensive formation is only effective if you stay and engage with it. Just go around it, and it becomes irrelevant. The Hospitaller contingent, meanwhile, hit the camps nearest to a small wadi, a seasonal streambed that was dry in September. About 1,500 men had been camped along both banks. When the Hospitallers charged through, the panicked men ran, many of them straight into the wadi. In daylight, they would have seen it was only 10 feet deep. In the darkness, dozens jumped blindly, breaking legs and ankles. The Hospitallers simply rode along the rim of the wadi, dropping rocks and shooting crossbows into the trapped men below. The critical moment, when numbers should have mattered. At about 3:20 in the morning, the inevitable happened. A Muslim commander of exceptional courage and competence managed to organize a counterattack. His name is lost to history, but his actions were recorded in both Christian and Muslim chronicles. He was likely a senior emir, one of Saladin's veteran officers. When the attack began, he'd been sleeping in one of the southern camp clusters. The screaming and thunder of hooves woke him, and unlike most of his men, his first instinct wasn't to flee, it was to fight. He gathered approximately 200 men, the ones who had grabbed weapons, the ones whose tents happened to be far enough from the initial strikes to give them crucial seconds of preparation. He positioned them in a defensive line across what he correctly identified as the raiders' withdrawal route. In the pre-dawn darkness, he couldn't see how many attackers there were, but he understood the tactical situation. They had struck from the north, they would need to withdraw north, and if he could block that route, he could trap them against the ocean. It was brilliant tactical thinking. Under normal circumstances, it would have worked. The Hospitaller contingent, the southernmost of the 4 raiding groups, rode straight into this ambush. 20 knights at full gallop suddenly confronted a prepared defensive line of 200 infantry, spears set, swords drawn, shields locked. This should have been where the raid failed. This should have been where numerical superiority reasserted itself, where the Muslims rallied and turned the tables on the attackers. Instead, the Hospitallers demonstrated why they were considered among the most elite warriors in Christendom. They didn't panic, they didn't scatter, they didn't try to break through the line. They simply stopped, wheeled their horses, and charged the defensive line from an angle rather than head-on. At the same time, the Templar contingent, hearing the sounds of sustained fighting rather than the quick massacre of sleeping men, realized one of their brother groups was in trouble and rode to reinforce. 40 armored knights hit 200 infantry from 2 directions simultaneously. The defensive line held for perhaps 30 seconds, an eternity in medieval combat. Spears thrust upward, unhorsing 2 knights. Swords struck horse legs, bringing down 3 more destriers. The Muslim warriors fought with desperate courage, knowing this was their chance to turn the tide. But medieval warfare was brutal mathematics. 40 knights represented perhaps 10 tons of armored cavalry. 200 infantry, unarmored and hastily organized, represented excellent fighters in a fundamentally inferior tactical position. The Crusader knights smashed through the withdrawal, dawn breaking over carnage. By 3:45 in the morning, approximately 45 minutes after the initial strike, the 80-man raiding force was withdrawing north along their pre-planned routes. Behind them, the coastal plain was a scene from hell. 7,000 men had been encamped across roughly 2 square miles. Conservative estimates, compiled from both Crusader and Muslim sources, put the dead at between 4,000 and 5,000. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 5,000 men killed in 45 minutes by 80 attackers. How is that mathematically possible? Because most of the dead weren't killed in combat. They were killed in their sleep, or while fleeing, or trampled in the panic, or killed by their own comrades in the darkness and chaos. The Crusader Knights were the spark that ignited a catastrophe, but the catastrophe itself was created by panic, darkness, and the complete collapse of command and control. Another 1,500 to 2,000 were wounded, some from Crusader weapons, many from being trampled by fleeing horses and running men. The remaining 1,000 or so had fled far enough, fast enough, to escape the kill zone entirely. As dawn broke around 5 o'clock that morning, Muslim survivors and rescuers from Saladin's main force, arriving from inland positions, confronted a landscape of horror. Bodies lay in clusters around the cold campfires. Blood soaked the sand in dark patches. Wounded men screamed for water, for medical help, for death. Abandoned equipment lay everywhere: weapons, armor, food supplies, personal possessions. The 80 raiders rendezvoused at their designated rally point around 4:30 in the morning, as the eastern sky began to pale. They had lost 11 knights killed and 19 wounded seriously enough to need medical attention, a casualty rate of 37%. Under normal military calculations, a unit suffering such losses would be considered mauled, potentially broken. But they had accomplished their mission. More than accomplished it, they had exceeded even Richard's expectations for devastation. They rode back into the Crusader lines as full sun rose over the Mediterranean, exhausted, covered in blood, some barely staying in their saddles from wounds. Richard himself met them at the perimeter, and according to chronicler accounts, he walked among them personally, thanking each man individually. The aftermath, numbers and consequences. The immediate military consequences were straightforward. Saladin lost approximately 5,000 fighting men in a single night, along with substantial supplies and equipment left behind in the chaotic retreat from the coastal camps. But the psychological consequences were far more significant. Saladin's strategy depended on his forces maintaining the initiative, constantly harassing the Crusaders, denying them rest and security. The Night Raid reversed that equation. Now Muslim forces had to worry about their own security. They had to post heavier guards. They had to maintain tighter camp discipline. They had to sleep knowing that the darkness itself had become weaponized. Muslim chronicler Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who was with Saladin's forces, recorded the aftermath. The warriors became fearful of the night. They would not sleep except in groups, with many sentries. The boldness they had shown in approaching the Frankish army was replaced with caution. They understood that the English king was not content to be prey, he had become the hunter. The psychological impact rippled through both armies. In the Crusader camp, morale soared. They had been on the defensive for weeks, being bled by constant harassment, wondering if their campaign would simply attrition away into failure. Suddenly, they had struck back with devastating effectiveness. The Night Raid became legendary almost immediately, growing in the telling, but the core truth remained. 80 men had killed thousands. In Saladin's army, doubt began to creep in. These were professional warriors, veterans of decades of warfare against Crusader states. They had won great victories, the recapture of Jerusalem itself just 4 years earlier, but they had never faced anyone quite like Richard. The Sultan was a brilliant strategist, a generous leader, a unifying force for the Muslim response to the Crusades, but in terms of pure tactical aggression and military innovation, Richard was something new. Saladin himself reportedly met with his senior commanders after the massacre and made a critical strategic decision. He would no longer attempt to shadow the Crusader army at close range. Instead, he would adopt a more defensive posture, positioning his forces further inland, controlling the routes to Jerusalem, but avoiding the kind of close proximity that enabled raids like the one on September 7th. This was exactly what Richard wanted. By taking the offensive in such a dramatic and brutal fashion, he had forced Saladin into a more passive stance. The strategic initiative had shifted. The Long Shadow, how 80 Nights changed medieval warfare. The September 7th raid became a case study in several military principles that wouldn't be formally articulated until centuries later. First, it demonstrated the principle of concentration of force at the decisive point. 80 Nights, concentrated in time and space against scattered, vulnerable targets, became locally overwhelming despite being globally outnumbered 80-1. This is the same principle that would be rediscovered by Napoleon, refined by the German General Staff, and formalized in modern military doctrine. Second, it proved the value of night operations and surprise when executed by highly trained special forces. Medieval armies rarely fought at night because the risks of confusion, friendly fire, and disorganization were considered too high. Richard showed that those risks could be managed if you had the right men, the right intelligence, and the right objectives. This wouldn't become standard practice for centuries, but the precedent was established. Third, it demonstrated the psychological dimension of warfare. Richard didn't just kill 5,000 men, he broke the confidence of Saladin's army and enhanced the morale of his own forces. The tactical victory at Arsuf had been significant, but it was a conventional battle with conventional results. The Night Raid was something different. It was warfare as psychological operation, designed as much to terrify and demoralize as to inflict casualties. The raid also influenced Richard's subsequent campaign planning. He would go on to successfully negotiate access to Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims, even though he never recaptured the city itself. Many historians argue that Saladin's willingness to negotiate favorable terms was directly influenced by his recognition that Richard was simply too dangerous an opponent to fight conventionally. Better to make a treaty than to continue bleeding men in a war of attrition against a commander who had proven he could strike anywhere, anytime. In the broader context of the Crusades, the Night Raid represented a high point of Crusader tactical effectiveness. The Third Crusade would ultimately end in a negotiated peace rather than the recapture of Jerusalem, but it stabilized the Crusader states for another century. Richard's military achievements, Arsuf, the Night Raid, his successful march to within sight of Jerusalem became legendary in both Christian and Muslim traditions. Military theorists in later centuries would study the raid as an example of asymmetric warfare. How does a smaller force defeat a larger one? By refusing to fight on the larger force's terms, by using mobility, surprise, and aggression to create local advantages that overcome global disadvantages, by understanding that warfare isn't just about numbers, it's about psychology, timing, and the willingness to take calculated risks. The moral complexity, massacre as military necessity. Modern readers are likely uncomfortable with the glorification of what was, by any measure, a massacre of sleeping men. It violates contemporary notions of honorable combat, of rules of engagement, of the laws of war. Men were killed in their sleep, given no chance to surrender, no quarter offered. This is where historical context becomes crucial. Medieval warfare was brutal by nature. The rules that did exist, prohibitions on killing clergy, ransoming prisoners rather than executing them, applied primarily within Christian Europe and among the knightly class. Warfare between Christians and Muslims in the Crusader context operated under different norms. Both sides regularly executed prisoners, conducted raids on civilian populations, and employed tactics that would be considered war crimes under modern law. Richard himself was capable of extraordinary cruelty even by medieval standards. Just weeks before the night raid, after capturing Acre, he had ordered the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners because negotiations over their ransom were proceeding too slowly for his timeline. The massacre was conducted in full view of Saladin's forces as a demonstration of Richard's willingness to prioritize military efficiency over mercy. So the night raid wasn't an aberration. It was consistent with Richard's character and the broader context of Crusader-Muslim conflict. From his perspective, he was conducting a legitimate military operation against an enemy army. The fact that many of the enemy were sleeping was simply an exploitable tactical advantage, no different from attacking an enemy during a river crossing or while they were strung out on the march. From the Muslim perspective, the raid was a horrifying violation of the conventions of honorable warfare. Even by the brutal standards of the time, attacking sleeping men was considered cowardly, dishonorable. But it was also undeniably effective, which created a painful recognition: honor doesn't matter much if you're dead. This moral complexity is part of what makes the raid historically significant. It forces us to confront the reality that military effectiveness and moral righteousness don't always align. Richard was, simultaneously, a brilliant tactician and a ruthless killer. The raid saved Crusader lives by demoralizing the enemy and shifting the strategic balance. It also killed thousands of men who never had a chance to defend themselves. History doesn't require us to resolve this tension, only to acknowledge it. The men behind the legend, who were these 80 knights? We know tantalizingly few details about the individual warriors who participated in the raid. Medieval chronicles focus on kings and nobles, not ordinary knights, and while the raid was celebrated, the specific participants weren't generally named in the historical record. But we can reconstruct the type of men they must have been. These were career warriors, men who had been training for combat since boyhood. A knight in 1191 wasn't like a modern soldier who serves a few years and then returns to civilian life. The knightly class was defined by warfare. You trained from age 7 as a page, learning horsemanship and basic combat. At 14, you became a squire, serving a knight and learning the practical details of armor, weapons, and battlefield tactics. In your late teens or early 20s, if you proved worthy, you were knighted and became a warrior by profession and identity. The 80 men who rode out on September 7th had likely been training for 15 to 20 years. They could control a warhorse with their knees while wielding a 12-foot lance. They could fight for hours in 60 pounds of armor. They could kill efficiently with sword, mace, lance, or bare hands. They were the special operations forces of their era, elite, expensive, highly trained. Many were probably veterans of previous crusades or campaigns in France. The Templars and Hospitallers had been fighting in the Holy Land for generations. Richard's household knights had fought with him in Aquitaine and Normandy. These weren't fresh recruits, they were hardened professionals. And they volunteered for a mission that had perhaps a 50-50 chance of survival. Think about that level of courage or fatalism or faith, call it what you will. They knew the odds. They knew that if things went wrong, they would die in darkness, far from help, overwhelmed by numbers. They went anyway. Some for religious reasons, the crusade was, in their minds, a holy war to reclaim sacred ground. Some for loyalty to Richard, who inspired devotion in his men even as he drove them mercilessly. Some for the glory and the fame that came with participating in legendary military actions. And some, probably, because violence was what they knew, and they were simply very good at it. 11 of them didn't come back. Their names are lost. They died in the darkness of a Palestinian night 935 years ago, killed by spears and swords while conducting a massacre. Medieval chronicles don't record where they were buried, whether their bodies were recovered, whether their families ever learned the specific details of their deaths. But their actions that night changed the course of a war and influenced military thinking for centuries. That's the strange alchemy of history, individual lives, brief and forgotten, that nonetheless ripple forward through time. Richard's genius, the man who weaponized darkness. King Richard I of England was 34 years old at the time of the raid. He would live only 8 more years, dying in 1199 from an infected crossbow wound suffered while besieging a minor castle in France, an absurdly mundane death for a legendary warrior. But in 1191, he was at the peak of his powers, and the Night Raid exemplified everything that made him both brilliant and terrifying. Richard understood warfare at a level that most of his contemporaries didn't. He grasped the geometry of force, how numbers could be overcome by concentration and timing. He understood psychology, how terror could break an army more thoroughly than casualties. He understood logistics and reconnaissance. His scouts had provided him with actionable intelligence, and he'd acted on it immediately. Most importantly, Richard understood something that many commanders throughout history have failed to grasp. Sometimes the most audacious course of action is the safest. A conventional approach, continuing the slow march toward Jerusalem, bleeding men daily to harassment, would have likely ended in failure. The Night Raid was insane by conventional standards, but it worked precisely because it was unexpected, because Saladin's forces couldn't conceive that Richard would attempt something so brazenly aggressive. This is a pattern throughout Richard's military career. At Jaffa, later in the same campaign, he would personally lead a charge with just 54 knights into thousands of Muslim soldiers and somehow prevail. He seemed to operate on a different calculus than other commanders, willing to gamble everything on bold strikes rather than cautiously managing resources. It made him extraordinarily effective. It also made him, in many ways, a terrible king. Richard spent perhaps 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in England. He saw the kingdom primarily as a source of money to fund his wars. He bankrupted the royal treasury, sold offices and titles, and levied crushing taxes. But on the battlefield, he was unmatched. The Night Raid was Richard's genius distilled to its essence. See the opportunity, calculate the odds, commit completely, execute brutally, win decisively. Echoes through time, the Night Raid in historical memory. The massacre of September 7th, 1191, entered the mythology of both Christian and Muslim traditions, though interpreted very differently. In Christian chronicles and legends, it became a story of heroic courage and divinely blessed military genius. Richard the Lionheart, champion of Christ, striking down the infidel with righteous fury. The 80 Knights became legendary figures, their raid proof that God favored the Crusader cause. Medieval poems and songs celebrated the raid as an example of Christian martial virtue. In Muslim traditions, the raid was remembered as an example of Frankish treachery and dishonorable warfare. The tale was used to illustrate the necessity of vigilance and the dangerous cunning of the Crusader warriors. But there was also a grudging respect. These were formidable enemies, and underestimating them led to disaster. As the centuries passed and the Crusades faded from living memory into history, the raid became a footnote, a curious incident in a complex campaign. Military historians occasionally referenced it as an early example of special operations tactics, but it never achieved the fame of Agincourt or Waterloo or Gettysburg. In recent decades, with increased interest in medieval history and the Crusades, the raid has received new attention. Military analysts have studied it as an example of asymmetric tactics. Historians have examined it for what it reveals about Richard's command style and the psychology of Crusader armies. Some have criticized it as a war crime, others defended it as a legitimate military operation within the context of its time. The truth, as usual, is complex. The raid was simultaneously a brilliant tactical achievement, a horrifying massacre, a demonstration of military innovation, and a product of the brutal realities of medieval warfare. It can be all these things at once, without contradiction. The lessons that echo what September 7th still teaches. 935 years later, what can we learn from 80 nights killing thousands in the Palestinian darkness? First, that numerical superiority doesn't guarantee victory. 7,000 men should have been able to overwhelm 80 attackers, but numbers only matter if they're organized, prepared, and able to bring their strength to bear. The Muslim forces were scattered, vulnerable, and psychologically unprepared. They never had the chance to leverage their numerical advantage. Second, that surprise and initiative can overcome almost any disadvantage. The Crusader raiders held the initiative for the critical 45 minutes of the attack. By the time organized resistance could form, the damage was done and the raiders were withdrawing. Third, that psychological impact is as important as physical casualties. The 5,000 dead were a significant loss, but the demoralization of Saladin's army and the boost to Crusader confidence had strategic effects that outlasted the immediate casualties. Fourth, that special operations, small, elite units conducting high-risk missions, can achieve effects out of all proportion to their size. This is a lesson that modern militaries have learned and relearned. The raid was 18th century special forces tactics, 700 years early. Fifth, that leadership matters enormously. Richard personally selected the raiders, planned the operation, briefed the commanders, and made the strategic decision to authorize a mission that his own council doubted. His judgment, his understanding of warfare, and his willingness to take calculated risks made the difference between success and disaster. Sixth, that war is fundamentally about will and psychology, not just resources and numbers. Saladin's forces had superior numbers and knowledge of terrain. The Crusaders had better armor and tactics, but they were outnumbered and far from home. What made the difference was Richard's absolute determination to seize the initiative and his ability to inspire his men to follow him into darkness against impossible odds. And finally, the raid teaches us that history is made by individual decisions and actions that ripple forward in ways that no one can fully predict. Richard decided to authorize the raid. 80 men decided to volunteer. Those decisions, made in the heat and uncertainty of a military campaign 9 centuries ago, influenced the course of the Crusade, affected the balance between Christian and Muslim power in the Levant, and became a case study in military tactics that's still discussed today. The final accounting, blood in the sand. As the sun rose on September 8, 1191, and the full scope of the carnage became clear, both sides had to reckon with what had happened. For Saladin, it was a disaster compounded by humiliation. He had underestimated Richard, had allowed his forces to become complacent and vulnerable. He would spend the remainder of the campaign being more cautious, more defensive, ultimately leading to a negotiated peace rather than decisive victory. The night raid didn't lose him the war, but it cost him the initiative. For Richard, it was a triumph that validated his aggressive tactical philosophy. He had demonstrated that even outnumbered and on the strategic defensive, a well-led force could strike devastating blows. The raid bought him time, space, and psychological advantage. It's one of the reasons he was able to negotiate terms that, while falling short of recapturing Jerusalem, secured Christian access to the holy sites and stabilized the Crusader kingdoms for another generation. For the 80 raiders who survived, it was a night that would define their lives. They had participated in one of the most dramatic military operations of the medieval era. Some would go on to distinguished careers, others would die in later battles, but they would always be remembered as the men who rode into darkness with Richard Lionheart and emerged victorious against impossible odds. And for the 5,000 Muslim warriors who died that night, professional soldiers, volunteers for jihad, men with families and homes and lives that ended abruptly in blood and chaos, they became a cautionary tale. They were skilled fighters, brave men, veterans of campaigns across the Levant, but skill and courage weren't enough when they were vulnerable, and their enemy was ruthless enough to exploit that vulnerability without mercy. The coastal plains south of Arsuf, where 7,000 men camped and 5,000 died, is now part of modern Israel, developed and built over. The blood and bones long since turned to dust and disappeared into the land. There's no monument to the men who died there, no marker indicating that one of the most dramatic night raids in military history took place on that ground. But history remembers, the chronicles record it, the tactical manuals reference it, and students of warfare still study the night of September 7th, 1191, when 80 Christian knights proved that in war numerical odds are only one variable in the equation of victory, and that a ruthless will, perfect timing, and elite training can sometimes rewrite the mathematics of death itself. Coda, the darkness as weapon. In the end, what Richard the Lionheart accomplished that night was something profound. He transformed darkness itself from a constraint on military operations into a weapon. For centuries, armies had ceased fighting at nightfall because darkness made coordination impossible, made friend indistinguishable from foe, made the risks too high. Richard understood that these same constraints affected both sides, but they affected a scattered, complacent enemy more than a concentrated, prepared strike force. He weaponized the darkness, turned it from a limitation into an advantage, and in doing so demonstrated a principle that would echo through military history. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one you carry, but the one you create from the circumstances themselves. On September 7th, 1191, 80 knights rode into the Palestinian darkness, carrying lances and swords. But what they really carried was a lesson that would resonate for centuries, that human ingenuity, courage, and ruthlessness can transform even the most daunting odds into opportunity, and that in war, there is no such thing as a truly safe moment, not in daylight, and certainly not in the hours before dawn when sleep should bring rest, but instead brings the thunder of hooves and the merciless harvest of steel. The night itself had become a battlefield, and Richard had won it.